Hello, and welcome to Threads of Fate, a podcast about astrology, divination, and the threads of fate that weave throughout all of our lives. I'm Kira, I'm your host, and today we're going to be doing something a little bit different. In past episodes, we've really been focusing on astrology, but as I just mentioned, this is a podcast about astrology and divination, of which astrology is one form of. And today we're going to be expanding into the realm of tarot and talking about how it intersects with astrology in exciting and sometimes infuriating ways. And I wanted to have this conversation with none other than my favorite diviner and tarot reader, Ashley McQuaid of Eight of Pentacles. Ash, welcome to the show.
Hello, thank you so much. So excited to be here.
Ash is genuinely the best tarot reader I've ever been to, and also a really good friend of mine, and the only person I trust to really read my cards. And so when I was even envisioning this podcast way back when, I knew that I was going to have you on at some point. And I think we've been talking about doing this episode for months now. And we
Mhm.
really wanted to talk about the death card because you have a special relationship with the death card. And the death card and the sign Scorpio in astrology are connected. And we're going to talk about why that is. But Ash, you are much, much better versed in the history of the tarot and why there even are connections between tarot and astrology in the first place. So, can you run us through some of that history a little bit?
Yeah, absolutely. So I'm going to focus on the visuals of tarot itself, and I'm going to forewarn the audience that I have what my husband calls a reading vocabulary, which means that I know a lot of big words and how to use them, but I've never said them out loud. So
Love.
we're, we're going to handle that. Um, yeah, so tarot originates we first see it come out as tarocchi, a card playing game in northern Italy in kind of the very end of the Middle Ages. So mid 15th century, we have the really gorgeous Visconti Sforza tarot decks that are dated to about 1440, 1450. And this game, which was for just playing cards, for gambling, all that good stuff, has kind of a more traditional, the pip cards, and then the trumps, which I can't pronounce Italian, but would have been called trionfi in the original game. And those images, this of course was a Roman Catholic society, and those images were religious allegories. They would have been actually very popular parade floats for victory parades for
Oh,
folks coming
cool.
back from war. Yeah, I had to go refresh on this, but a lot of the trumps actually would have been images that would have been familiar to folks. Some of them even having like kind of a satirical angle, because of course, before we had the High Priestess, we had La Papesse, which the Golden Dawn, starts to judge later on.
Hmm.
So yeah, judging. So, the cards themselves for playing card games emerged actually a couple centuries before we start seeing them used for fortune telling. So, for fortune telling would have emerged around kind of the 1790s in France. And
Hmm.
France is where we really see this occult secret society current really getting rolling before it comes over to Britain. And so this would have been a couple decades after it was popular to start doing divination, which is regular playing cards. It's out of that same climate that we see Lenormand come out of when divining with card games starts to get really popular, which I feel like that in and of itself is just such a human thing. Like
Yeah.
we love reading signs in whatever we can find,
We
right?
love an
So
omen.
yeah. There's a lot of criticism about like, oh, tarot is not really like this ancient knowledge. It was never meant for divination, but we love a sign.
Yeah.
Um,
I mean, we use everything.
so
We use coffee, we use entrails, we use birds, nature. I mean, it just stands to reason that you can kind of, and if you're a really skilled diviner, almost use anything to divine. And that's kind of just your framework through which you view reality a lot of the time, you know? So I feel like there
absolutely.
is kind of this way of just like we humans, we like to look for patterns, we like to figure out what it all means. And so why would we not do that with tarot,
Absolutely.
you know?
Yeah. Which is really why all of this, like, that's where all this squishing comes from. There's this current happening in France around this time of wanting to tap into this sort of mythical, like, secret society fighting for the forces of good that has gone back since the time of Jesus. And so all of these systems must connect into some kind of eternal universal truth. And this wouldn't have even necessarily have been I'm trying to think of the word I want, like controversial with Christianity, like even being like a Catholic or a Protestant society, because they kind of saw Christianity as perfecting these sort of truths that started
Mm.
with Egypt and Greece and Rome, and they saw it as just like the latest evolution. So these wouldn't have necessarily been in conflict for these like Christian occultists. And so we have get ready for my French pronunciation. We have Antoine Coeur de Gébelin.
I mean, not bad. I would say it's like more Antoine Cœur de Gébelin, mais
Right,
ça va.
what you just said.
There you go.
Um, so he sees people playing this game and he has the idea to start to tie it back to Egyptian theology. And there's this preoccupation in the Middle Ages with Egypt because it was seen as the oldest known ancient
Mm.
society at the time. So that's like kind of the oldest, the farthest back that you could go. So then Jean-Baptiste Alliot,
Not
also
bad.
known as, okay, Ataya, was the first to actually start assigning meanings to the card. And so he expanded on these ideas and interpreted the trumps into the Book of Thoth.
Mhm.
Was his sort of contribution. So now you have this idea that these cards that came out of Roman Catholic religious allegory are tied back to Egypt. And then the person who really takes this to the next level is so everyone in the magical world knows him as Eliphas Levi. That's not his real name. His name is Alphonse Louis Constant.
Not bad.
Okay, we love. And so he expands on this and reinterprets tarot from the Book of Thoth into the Book of Hermes. And his he is really like a direct precursor to the Golden Dawn. And I'm just grabbing this excerpt. This is The Triumph of the Moon by Ronald Hutton. And it's a history of how pagan witchcraft in Britain comes to be, but it very naturally is kind of a history of ceremonial magic and occult secret societies as sort of a precursor. And so he talks about Levi. He refashioned that myth of the Book of Thoth into the Book of Hermes. Book of
Look,
Hermes. We
Thermes.
love Mercury's. Blah, 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 blah. So, in his version of history, the succession of secret societies has handed down not just a political commitment, but a true knowledge of the nature of the universe and of how to manipulate the forces of which it was constructed. Thus, he linked ancient Egyptian religion with the Templars and the legend of the Holy Grail and blended the two greatest early modern European magical systems, the Kabbalah, with its purported map of the structure of the universe, and the tarot cards as divinatory aids. So he's taken a lot. He's
He's
taken a
really
lot.
just like picking and choosing any culture, any society. Why not just mix them all together in a way that makes sense to
Yeah,
him, right?
absolutely. And I think that's the biggest thing for me. And all of this is gnosis, whether any of them wants to admit it or
Sure.
not. And you see a lot of them talking about uh, rectifying. Rectifying is a word that gets used a lot, where they're making now the right version of something.
Mm.
Um, so Levy, and then another contemporary that other folks might know would be Helena Blavatsky. Those folks are kind of the first generation of secret magical societies, the Theosophical Society. And then the Golden Dawn, who are the progenitors of a lot of the tarot and astrological symbolism we know today,
Hmm.
grow out of them.
Okay.
And so the Golden Dawn started actually putting together, the founders started putting together their tarot and astrological symbolism before they were even a society. So they're taking all of these systems, the Kabbalah, the Hebrew alphabet, tarot, astrology, and we have the cipher manuscripts, which you and I were looking at a scan of prior to this episode and losing
Yeah.
our minds.
Losing our minds.
Yeah. So the cipher manuscripts are dated to about 1809. And these are documents where you can actually see, among other things, they're working on their tarot and astrological
Associations.
correspondences.
Hmm.
Yeah. And I like the way, so Mary Greer, who's a fantastic cartomancer, she describes French and British magicians as like seeing tarot as this esoteric puzzle, and they're like racing each other to solve it. So they're like
Mm.
desperate to kind of maybe desperate's dramatic, but they're really wanting to kind of like lock these systems of truths in together.
Yeah. I
Um,
mean, it feels desperate because it doesn't, there are some ways in which it fits and it makes really perfect sense to me. One of those being the overlap of like the minor arcana and the decans. Like this, they map so well together. And I know we can talk, maybe we shouldn't talk about that because we'll go off on a whole tangent about it. But there are ways in which like that makes sense. And then when you like see what they tried to do with the major arcana, you're like, this doesn't really fit. And yet, of course, as anything that we have kind of given meaning to over enough time, it does kind of match now. Like I think when we were exploring this episode and looking at Death and Scorpio together, like no, it does actually make sense. Like there are a lot of ways that these overlaps do speak to each other. But then when you see the system and the way that they're organizing this, I was losing my mind, you guys. It was like I was reading T. Susan Chang's tarot correspondences book, trying to understand like what is going on here. Oh no. Shit. We paused. Did you see that?
it's that internet. Yeah.
Okay.
You're good. I could hear you the whole time.
I mean,
Yeah. Your video did a little
did a little
jiggle, but
jumpity. Okay, whatever. I'll just say I'll jump back in and
yeah.
I'll edit. Okay. I was reading T. Susan Chang's book on tarot correspondences, and she was basically like, yeah, there's 23 and 22, and so you really want to make it fit because you have 12 zodiac signs, you have 7 planets, then you have 4 elements, but that's 23 and you have 22 major arcana, so it's really compelling. And I'm like, is it? Is it compelling? And she's like, because it doesn't fit. And she's like, what if we just, so like, and she's explaining their thinking, obviously not hers. She's like, so we just take out Earth because Earth is everywhere. So we don't need that element anymore. So we'll just assign one of the major arcana, of which death is one, to a zodiac sign. And some of the other ones will be assigned to a planet. And some of the other ones will be assigned to an element. And it almost fits, but it doesn't. And this was just making me lose my mind when we were researching this because I didn't realize that they were just like throw out one of the elements. We don't need her. We don't need Earth actually because she's here. What
Right.
is that thinking? What is that thinking, Ash? Tell me.
Right. I know. Well, and what's funny is what I love about the sketch from the cipher manuscripts that we were looking at is the hand-drawn crooked table of it all. Like, oh my God, like us as people, we've been doing this for so long. It looked like something that could have come out of my notebook. Like I had, some like bong rip moment and was like, hold up,
I figured
you
it
know?
out.
Exactly. And so the Golden Dawn, like, put together these correspondences in their founding documents. I don't know how much, individual members of the Golden Dawn necessarily agreed, disagreed, and they definitely each had their own interpretations of the system. So the Golden Dawn, one of the founders, Samuel Mathers, and his wife, whose first name I'm probably going to butcher, Moena, they had a deck that they created with Moena's art, and members were encouraged to kind of make their own tarot decks based off of hers. And my understanding is that a lot of these decks incorporated imagery that was actually like pretty close to the original card game,
Hmm.
which I think makes a ton of sense when you think about the fact that it's a lot of just, you know, it's religious allegory themes that have been important for humans for centuries.
Yeah.
So it makes sense that there's still going to be a lot of this is still going to feel really resonant, especially within kind of this Christian kind of working frame. And Arthur Waite was I don't know that I want to call him a shit starter, but he was one of the main sort of like schismatic folks within the group because you have on, he's like one extreme end where he was an extremely devout Christian. The magic of the group is really about self-empowerment for him, whereas on the other end, you have Crowley.
Right.
Right.
Quite a divisive figure if you don't know.
Yes.
Hmm.
Yeah, and it's these two and a couple others that eventually lead to the Golden Dawn kind of having some splinter organizations based on like how pagan are we really? How
Right.
Christian are we really? How are
Right.
we dealing with demons? So that just to gives you kind of a flavor of the different sort of imagery and like the ways they wanted to use the symbols. And it's Waite who's ideas are influencing a lot of modern tarot culture. There is the Thoth deck from Crowley, but I
Hmm.
think folks in just kind of like in pop culture have a lot less familiarity with that deck. Like folks who are
Totally.
already into it know what it is, you know?
Hmm. I feel like Thoth is the deck for occultists,
Yes.
versus like the Rider Waite Smith deck or Smith Waite deck is the deck that all of the tarot girlies have. It's the one that
Yes.
Urban
Yeah.
Outfitters sells, right? Like you're not going to find the Thoth
Right.
deck there. You're probably going to need to go to a metaphysical shop to find that. So
The
like they're
Thoth deck at Urban Outfitter.
could you imagine? So like
Can
they're
you?
one is a
Oh,
lot more common, and I think even the Waite Smith deck has a lot of other decks that are based on it
oh yeah.
now. Like they pull
Hmm.
from that imagery. And so our understanding really of tarot today tends to be a little bit more based on that. And sometimes even when you look at the Thoth deck and you compare it with the Waite Smith deck, it feels like you're in two
Hmm.
different worlds a lot of the time.
Yeah. Yep. Yeah.
Yeah.
Very different. And so the way the deck was produced is so Waite had a lot of really specific ideas about how he wanted the majors to look. And then of course Pamela Coleman Smith did all the art for the deck. We
Mm-hmm.
don't 100% know which of them, and I guess this isn't super relevant for our conversation about death today, but we don't know for sure which of them came up with the ideas for the minor arcana imagery, because that was really the two of them. Their major innovation was doing art for the pip cards.
Yeah.
Um, and what I think, though, is kind of most important to note for our purposes is they already had tarot and astrology correspondences when they made this deck.
Yeah.
So they baked those into the Smith Waite. So the correspondences come before the Smith
Mm-hmm.
Waite deck.
Mm-hmm.
So I think that's just kind of useful as a frame because they purposefully, and Waite especially, was molding the imagery of the cards to fit his ideas about
Yeah.
different symbolic correspondences. And there's a lot with color usage and numerology too. Personally, I see a number and my brain like fuzzes, but I know there's a lot of interesting work with that as well. Yeah, so that's what really gets us to here. And I do have a Smith Waite death card handy. So for folks who are listening, the original Smith-Waite card has Death as this really rather fearsome
Mm-hmm.
soldier wearing black armor on a white horse on a battlefield. He has a white rose on a black flag. He's already trampled a king.
Mm-hmm.
And there is a priest, I believe, a maid, and a child
Yeah.
in front of him. And so, of course, Death in their astrological correspondences is Scorpio.
Mm-hmm.
And I know one of the things that we were having a time about is it's Scorpio. It's not Mars, it's Scorpio because they
Yes.
split the planets and the signs apart to make them fit enough
Yeah.
to have enough elements.
Yes. And what's so interesting about this is like, obviously, our understanding of a sign, you can't really divorce it from its ruler, but our modern take on Scorpio tends to be Pluto. So people think
Mhm.
the death card and they think of Pluto, but
Yep.
they didn't even know about Pluto, right? When they made
They
this.
didn't, right. Yeah. So we
So,
had, right.
yeah.
So the cipher manuscripts are dated to about 1809. So Uranus was the only one of the outers that would have been discovered. So Uranus was 1781, Neptune was 1846, and then Pluto we didn't discover till 1930.
Yeah. So
And it's yeah,
yeah, it's just an interesting thing to think about because I think today so many people are like, "Oh, well, there's this relationship between the death card and transformation in the same way that people talk about Pluto as transformation, right? As being this kind of
hmm
phoenix rising from the ashes sort of thing and going through a lot of turmoil and difficulty and then kind of coming out the other side. And I find that that gets linked with Scorpio as a concept when that seems to be a bit of a newer kind of orientation towards the sign of Scorpio and what it represents versus what it has represented throughout antiquity and its relationship to Mars and not to Pluto. And that was just
right.
what really was fascinating to me because I was reading 78 Degrees by Rachel Pollack, and so much of what she's talking about with the death card is about Pluto. It's about that transformation component. And it's like, Scorpio is, and I'm a traditional astrologer. So sorry to all the modern astrologers out there, but I do not believe that the modern planets rule signs. They can have an affinity with them, sure. Rulership, you're going to lose me on that one. Like, I really am a Mars rules Scorpio person. And so it really started shifting my understanding of the death card to think about it through the lens of Scorpio as a sign, Scorpio as a water sign, Scorpio as Mars's nocturnal domicile, right? And kind of divorcing it from that context of Pluto and transformation. And I'm
Mhm.
curious for you, when you're thinking about the death card, do you jump to the kind of newer orientation of transformation? Do you have a little bit more of a Marsy, scorpionic approach, or how do you interpret death in the readings that you do and when it shows up for you?
Yeah. So I'm a lot of fun at parties. So I think transformation, less transformation and more conquering. Death has always been an important part of that card. And when I say always, I mean since it's been used, for divination. And I mean this, like to pull this guy up again, like he's like that's a very martial figure.
Yes.
Um, and so I think the what comes after death has traditionally been really important in tarot. I mean, it's in the middle of the major arcana, judgment, and then the world comes after, and it's judgment where you're kind of like conquering death, and here's what's come after. For me, because of my own practice, when the death card shows up for me, it's an ending, and I don't want to say that's it, but when I interpret the card, death is death. And if it's transformation that's coming after, we have to look elsewhere in the reading.
Mm,
And that's been important to me because transforming something evolving doesn't necessarily always have to involve death.
Hmm.
And death doesn't, I mean, it's transforming because something doesn't exist anymore.
Yeah.
So, yeah, so that's how I personally take a pretty hard line with it. I'm also definitely, very like on the hard deterministic line of the fate spectrum. So
We love to hear
again,
it.
super fun. But yeah, that's how I tend to read it. And I do think there's an element of that I see in some modern decks too, where we start getting into more like the decomposition aspect of it. So I have the Brady Tarot here, which has this really beautiful take that's about decomposition and evolution. So you've got a
Mm.
human skull at the top with amaranth growing from the eyes. Below the human skull, we have a smilodon, so a saber-toothed tiger. And even deeper below that is the Tyrannosaurus Rex. So it's these like layers of death that build on each other. And then a really popular deck, and I know a lot of people's first intro is the Wild Unknown.
Mm.
And the Wild Unknown goes very hard on decomposition. So this is a for those listening and not watching, it's a bird skeleton, kind of partially decomposed. We have some feathers, so I think that's something we're starting to see in a lot of kind of nature and animal based decks. But that is where I tend to go with it. Like the ending is the important part,
Yeah.
and if something is transforming and kind of what comes after, we have to kind of pull that out from other aspects of the reading.
Yeah, I love that. And I think it's so important too, because when we think about the time of year that is associated with Scorpio, right? When the sun
Hmm.
is
Hmm.
moving through that sign, at least in the northern hemisphere, things are dying, right? Plants, trees, shrubs are starting to die and they don't immediately grow back, right? There's a whole period of stillness that is accompanying that death. And maybe something will grow there someday again in the future when we hit, spring. But there's this whole kind of 6 month period where nothing grows there anymore. And it is a stillness. I think of Scorpio as being a sign of stillness, in a way that we don't normally associate with Mars, right? Because
Hmm.
Mars is
Hmm.
the planet of action and energy, but it's stillness that allows you to kind of gather your strength to strike in an opportune moment. And that time of year, that's what a lot of the plants are doing. Like they are getting rid of stuff to conserve their energy, so that in the future they can come back. But it's not an instant process. And I think when we jump immediately from death to, okay, we're transforming and there's new life immediately, and it's, one door closes and another door opens, it's like sometimes the door does actually just close, and sometimes you need space to sit in that and process that door being closed before you even begin to look for another door being open. And that might take many months, many years, and it's not like necessarily one and done, if that makes sense.
Yeah. Yeah, I've been thinking a lot about because I know when we were prepping for this episode, we were like, well, isn't death Capricorn? Isn't it
Yeah,
Saturn? But there's
yeah.
this stewing darkness with Scorpio with fixed water Mars that I think is really important for this card.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
I've taken myself like back around.
Yeah, I know, because when I was first really digging into this card, and even on the death card itself, the character on top of the horse is a skeleton, right? So it's
Hmm.
very easy to jump to Grim Reaper, right? It's very easy to
Yeah.
jump to Saturn. And I think what we see here is, we were going back and forth about this a lot, where it's like Saturn is the death itself. Mars is a little bit more about facing death, seeing it come for you, choosing to look at it straight in the eye. And we can say death as an ending, death as something that is exceedingly difficult for most people, right? And I think sometimes it can show up that way, like something is either coming to an end, but you have to face it. And I think that's what the death card can speak to a lot of times is it's like the thing is
Hmm.
still in the process of dying, but you haven't really faced the death yet. It's coming for you, and this idea of Mars as the god of war, right? And it's like, what do warriors do? They look death in the eye every time they go into battle. They kill and are killed, and that's a big part of their entire kind of archetype, right?
Mm.
Is the courage and the ferocity and the bravery that it takes to do that. And I think sometimes there is that kind of notion of facing death, whereas Capricorn, Saturn is more the actual thing being put in the ground and laid to rest.
Yeah. Yeah. And almost the concept of death itself
Mm-hmm.
versus yeah. And I think the facing of it is clearly really important to kind of this original but Golden Dawn concept. And don't quote me on this, but I actually, if I remember correctly, this is one of the cards that changed very little
Mm-hmm.
from the Tarot from the game.
Okay.
So kind of this imagery of people literally facing death on a battlefield is very important to this particular mental frame that we're dealing with here in
Yeah.
tarot. So even these decks that are like, I think the Wild Unknown is explicitly supposed to be Waite-Smith based. The kind of the decomposing skeleton is actually quite a different take.
Yeah.
It's fine. I'm actually also just looking at so the Fountain Tarot is pretty explicitly Waite-Smith and Hughes, like pretty closely, I think, to the symbolism. This death card is such a creepy little motherfucker. I think it's actually one of the more like unsettling death cards, like as I'm looking. So for folks who are listening, there's this skeletal horse with glowing eyes emerging out of this black background below these shadowy trees. And there's a skull looking down at the apex from this triangle of skeletal trees. And it's just this really cold, very Halloween season
Yeah.
image,
Yeah.
for Scorpio season. And the other thing I'm thinking about too with Scorpio season is the Irish festival of Samhain is the last harvest. That's your last chance to take everything in,
Mm,
and then we're done. So I think this like facing the end part of it is something that's coming up for me a lot when I think about
yeah.
the Scorpio symbolism.
Yeah, I think it's such a big part of this card, but also the part of Scorpio, right? Is like the ability to look at difficult things and to not shy away from them. And I think as a society, we are very bad at, well, I shouldn't say all society, but more in Western culture, right? We're really bad with death. We're bad at talking about it. We don't have kind of a culture that allows for grieving, or public displays of grief. It's kind of like someone dies and we're like, okay, move on, don't express that emotion, keep it down, right? Get back to work, and there's a weird relationship that develops out of that where I think there tends to be almost like a distancing from death that happens. And I find that Scorpio as a sign and an archetype doesn't do that as much. Like there is a comfort with taboo. And in a
Mm,
way, in the Western culture, I feel like death has become taboo, And so
mm,
it's like, oh, that's really interesting. Like one of the, kind of funnier Scorpio stereotypes that I find really true a lot of the time is like they love true crime. They're like, oh, like the who done it, the mystery, like who killed who. Like there's this fascination with something that is really deep and dark and heavy and that could even have, like potential implications of murder or, just true like maleficence as a core
yeah.
theme, right? But they're fascinated by it. They don't shy away from it, they go towards it. And I think because there is something inherently connected about Scorpio and death as a concept, And you can just even, as we were doing before, relate that back to the seasonality of Scorpio season, right? And it's like, well, there is a time when everything's dying. That is baked into the symbolism of your being when you are born during Scorpio season or when you have Scorpio placements, right? So there is kind of a comfort or familiarity, maybe is a better word, I think,
Hmm.
with just the concept of death, dying, difficulty, right? Mars is a malefic at the end of the day,
Hmm.
so death is malefic. And
Yeah.
that's kind of,
Yeah.
I feel like that's a big
Absolutely.
part of it.
Yeah. Um, it's been funny for me to pick apart that Saturn versus Mars tension
Mm-hmm.
with this a little bit. Um, and I think something that maybe might be fun to address too is I feel like I get resistant to Scorpio, which is funny for me because it's my midheaven.
Yes.
Like I don't have a choice but to kind of deal with this, but as this sort of very like glamorous like sex, death, and the occult kind of
Yeah.
situation that we have in pop culture. Um, there's a tangent in my head, but yeah, that's been something that has been interesting to me to come to grips with. Because I think, like, as I'm looking at these images, I feel like the decomposition imagery is a little more Saturnian
Mm-mm.
versus this obviously like the battlefield and like entering this like staring down this frightening scene, like those are much more martial.
Yes.
And I'm interested in that tension.
Me too. And I think it's because, the decomposition doesn't happen until the death has happened. Right.
Yeah.
And so there is
Yeah.
kind of this element of it that does feel distinctly more Saturnian. And even if you're bringing this back to kind of Scorpio or the comfort with like taboos or whatever, like you think about some cultures, right? And the way that they approach death is like you spend time with the body as it's
Mhm.
decomposing, right? You don't lock it into a coffin and put it into the ground and make it pretty. You know what I mean? There's a comfort there of like this is part of the natural process that happens here. And that feels very Saturnian in a way to
Mhm.
me versus the oh, death's coming for me and knocking at my door. Like, let me go open it up and see what death has to say. Like I think of it
Yeah.
as like Arya Stark in Game of Thrones. And it's like, what do you say to the
Mm.
god of death? And she's like, not today. It's like that kind of energy feels like the death card to me of there's all of these figures who are facing death. The king's been trampled. There's clearly this message that death comes for all of us. But there's also, I think, a little bit of a martial thing of like, not me though, like this
Hmm.
resistance to it, versus like Saturn is very much like, well, we're all going to die and it's going to come for me too. And I don't know, like there's this, yeah, this tension that you're talking about. I feel it too. And I think it's one of the reasons that the astrological correspondences, whilst we can pull meaning from them, feel unsatisfying because
Yeah.
there's a lot of ways in which the death card just feels like it should be the Capricorn card,
Yep.
you
Yeah,
know?
absolutely. And the other thing I'm thinking about here, like when you're talking about how different societies handle death
Yeah.
and the fact that the Trumps themselves come out of a Roman Catholic culture. Waite himself was a really devout Christian, and within Christianity, within Catholicism, death is something to be conquered. It's not something
Mm.
to be, it's not something to be accepted. Well, like accepted because you're going to conquer it. Like you're going to have the last laugh, you know, versus feeding back into the system. And I think that frame too is interesting for thinking about like where this comes from because you have death and then a few cards later you're going to have judgment when folks are rising up from the
Hmm.
ground, they've overcome death, and now we're all ascending bodily to heaven. So thinking about this death card coming out of that framework, like what would it look like if it had come out of the framework of a culture that sees death as more of a process?
Yeah, that is super fascinating to consider, especially when we think about the difference between like the Christian perspective over dying and then you go to heaven or hell, you whatever,
Mhm. You
versus
do whatever.
or whatever, you know. No offense to anybody out there. Um, I just didn't have an articulate way to say that. Versus like a culture who is a little bit more focused on something like reincarnation, right? Which is like the spirit is eternal. You are going to reincarnate. There is, death. And this is kind of, to me, almost Pluto transformation. I was like, this is the closest I can get to that kind of through line, right? Is like, well, you do die and your body decomposes, but your soul lives on. And like, we're going to go for another turn around the wheel, right? It's like, we're going to keep doing this. Maybe forever, and that's very different, right? And I think that breeds a different type of acceptance in some ways, because you're just going to go for another spin. Like it's not, you're not necessarily, depending on the culture and the tradition, right? Having like everything that you've ever done in your life be like weighed up to see where you're going next.
Yeah.
And so I think that I'm so glad that you brought that into the conversation because I think it is really important for understanding the death card, but also the context in which it came to be and why that might be a little bit more Mars than Saturn or Scorpio
Yeah.
versus Capricorn, because yeah, Mars is the conqueror at the end of the day, right? So there is already like
Hmm.
this kind of, yeah, like facing it sort of energy that comes with Mars, right? But like you're going to defeat it, right? Mars loves a antithesis, loves an enemy, loves something to overcome, so if all of a sudden we're overcoming death, it's like we're facing it, it's coming for us, we're able to conquer it, then that is a lot more Mars than it is Saturn, which is the Grim Reaper coming for us all. You can't escape this. And now your body is decomposing in the earth. And aren't you uncomfortable about that?
Yeah.
Laughs. I keep thinking
Yeah.
about the Barbie movie when she's like, do you guys ever think about dying? That feels like this
I love it.
conversation a lot. But yeah, I feel like there's a lot there. But even breaking down the sign of Scorpio from an ancient astrological perspective, something that I kept thinking about when we were preparing for this episode was how the moon, right, falls in Scorpio. She finds the sign of her fall there. And the moon is associated with life. And there is this kind of quote in, I think it's maybe Abu Mashar, who says like, there's no planet can exalt where the moon falls. Like no planet can be elevated or rised up, or kind of reaching a different level of resourcedness where the moon does so poorly because we need life for elevation and for resourcing. And I thought that was almost like the closest thing I could get to in ancient astrological
Hmm.
thought to Scorpio and death, right? It's like, of
Hmm.
course, the death card is related to the sign where there is no life because the moon struggles to be there.
Hmm. Yeah. You said something earlier too about still water that I thought was really interesting too.
Yeah. I mean, Scorpio is fixed water, right? So it doesn't
Yeah.
move. And I was reading Valens on Scorpio, and he has a lot of really terrible things to say about this sign. Makes haters of
Got
their
dumped
own
by a
family
Scorpio.
and murder, no, literally, murderers and plotters and all of these things. And then he also says something about how it's bad smells and foul odors. And I was thinking about this, and I love my job because my job is to go research what happens when water doesn't move and connect it back to what that means about Scorpio. And bacteria grows, when water doesn't move, and it can create a putrid smell, and so there is also this thing here around like bacteria and things that can harm you grow through this lack of movement or this stillness. And bacteria cause viruses cause plagues. Sometimes they can kill us, especially not in the age of modern medicine. So there
Hmm.
was also kind of that connection that I found really interesting, is like, yeah, what happens when things don't move? What happens when there is no life? Death. And the
Hmm.
circumstances that beget death.
Hmm. Yeah, there's something like I'm thinking about the other fixed elements, and you
Mm.
really don't get stagnancy with some of the others in the same way I think that you do with Scorpio, with
Yeah.
with fixed water versus like your fixed earth.
Yeah, it's like fixed earth is what, a mountain, you know what I mean? That's kind
Mhm.
of what I think of. And even mountains can change slowly over time with the conditions of the weather. Fixed air, can you stale, you can't really trap it. It's kind of hard. And then fixed fire is just like the fire that keeps on burning, but you still need oxygen for that to happen. So there is kind of like an element of stillness with Scorpio where you can get really still. And I think about how Mars is the planet of action and energy. And it's like, well, what does it do in that situation? And it's like, well, it goes deeper, it dives
Mhm.
further down because it can't really go anywhere else, right? This isn't a geyser shooting up, this isn't a channel or a river that flows. And so where do you move when everything is still? It's like, well, you go straight down. I think Scorpio
Mhm.
has that kind of tendency to plunge into the depths of something.
Mhm.
And I'm curious, do you ever feel like the death card shows up in a way that is not a death? Like, is there anything where it's like, this is facing difficulty, this is going deeper into something? Or is it really just like, we're done here with whatever the question is?
Yeah, so I think anytime it shows up, something is ending,
Mm-hmm.
but it can be tricky to pinpoint what that something is, especially if it's like say it's a card over a shorter time frame.
Mm-hmm.
Like I'm reading for my day or the
Sure.
week. Um and maybe something big is going to come up, but I do think that something always is going to end. And I think a lot of times, um, when folks think about the transformation element, they they jump straight to the transformation part. But for me, I think it does mean that you're transforming because you're going to stop doing something. You're gonna drop a particular mental framework, or you're gonna drop a
Mm.
given habit. Um, I'm struggling a lot to come up with just like a lighter example, just for me being a new mother. I can never get past that one because
Real.
postpartum is death. That is death. You will never. And I don't
RT.
even mean that in a bad way, in a bad way, but um there's sort of the death that comes at the beginning of pregnancy when there's no going back, and then there's the death that comes when you're not pregnant anymore.
Yeah.
And that's just like looming too big for me. But
No, but that's
there's
so
like,
real. That's so real. And it
yeah.
also feels connected to like the moon falling in Scorpio, and how the moon is connected to the
Mm,
mother, and how this whole
yep.
process of bringing something into being also necessitates death, and is also the way that most women died throughout history, was
Mm,
childbirth, right? So on top of the more metaphorical death, which doesn't necessarily feel so metaphorical in it,
yeah.
yeah, yeah, is can you tell that we had children recently? Um, you
They're
know,
so fun.
we're so fun at parties, you guys. Yeah, like there is that quality there too of like there is this metaphorical death happening in so many different facets of your life, and like this release and this letting go. And I don't know why I couldn't get the when you were saying that, like the picture of the moon falling in Scorpio out of my mind is like, yeah, hard, and it's hard for a reason, and it's because something is truly dying here. But that also kind of has to happen. That shedding has to happen so you can fully
Hmm.
step into a place where you don't maybe feel like the moon is fallen anymore.
Yeah, absolutely. And I touch on this a bit in the zine that I did that compares the death card with the coffin card in Lenormand, which also informs a lot of my personal death symbolism because I learned Lenormand first, is that something's always ending, and that doesn't even necessarily need to feel hard. Like, I
Yeah.
think it can be useful to acknowledge, just so long as you're acknowledging what is ending, and then that's why the transformation will be what it is. Another example that's coming to mind, like I do see it come up a bunch with career changes, I think is very classic.
Hmm.
But yeah, I think that's really where I land is it always means something's ending, you're giving something up, and you should acknowledge that. And you can also acknowledge that maybe it doesn't feel bad.
Yeah. Yeah. The most mundane example just came to me when you were saying that, which is like you've been in this long like back and forth with someone over email, and then it finally comes to an end and you're like, ah, thank God.
Corporate flashbacks.
Can you guys tell I really don't like emails? And just like, thank God that I don't have to keep this thing going anymore. Like a death that feels very mundane if you were just going to pull the death card in your day to day, but that also feels good, right? And maybe that does kind of like free up some mental energy. And I think one of the things that I loved about your Death in the Coffin zine, which everybody, it will be linked in the show notes below. It's really cool. No, it's really cool because no one makes physical stuff anymore. And you made this really cool, like physical thing with a tarot spread in it. And it just has these beautiful images, but also it makes you think about death in a different way, in a way that I think we've been talking about it a little bit more, which is like, it's a natural part of life. Like to live is to die. Like that is okay.
Hmm.
Um, but one of the things that you say in that zine, correct me if I'm wrong, is like, what can live now that this thing has died, or like what can
Hmm.
feed on
Exactly.
this
Yeah.
so there can be something. And I think that is like, again, the closest we get to transformation is like something dies and there can be space that opens up. We see that even with like the seasonality again, like these trees have died,
Yep.
right? And like something else can grow there someday. So there's space that comes from that. And I'm curious, when you included that in the scene and in that spread, where did that come from? And how do you feel like it relates back to everything we've been saying about death and Scorpio?
Yeah. So that zine um, was kind of a natural outgrowth of another just very short piece that I wrote on decomposition that in turn sort of fed out of finishing Merlin Sheldrake's book Entangled, and also visiting Kenya a few years ago, and watching death just left and right.
Mm-hmm.
So large there. And I had been thinking about, I had this, it was maybe a little bit of a bong rip moment, but I had this thought when I was back home, like a few months later, I was watching this cardinal go after a tiny butterfly. And I was like, but it's the same.
Yeah.
Like
It's the same
Africa,
as the
like,
lions in Africa.
yeah. The Western African grasslands just have the biome to support this happening on like a much grander scale with mammals instead of,
Mm-hmm.
a bird and an insect. But I was like, but it's the same. Um, so yeah, that's where a lot of that thought for me comes from, and something that I loved in the book Entangled is he talks about how there's basically a fungus to decompose anything. He was talking about a study where scientists basically trained a fungus to decompose cigarette butts. Like for everything, there is something that will eat it.
Yeah.
So yeah, that kind of train of thought is what really started to then inform my thinking on the death card, tied with the coffin card in Lenormand, which is very much about this is only ending, and that's because you really have to put multiple cards in a sequence to get a good reading. You don't necessarily just pull one Lenormand card, or like maybe
Hmm.
you do. We're humans. We like patterns. Like, do what you want. And so that is really what informed my thinking with the death card was like, what if I treat it like this, like always
Hmm.
an ending? And I think all of those trains of thought just kind of really naturally came together for me.
I love that.
Yeah, which I was just thinking I can really like tie back to Scorpio again with that seasonality because we think about the light dying at that time, but it's also like the final harvest, the final chance to sort of, I mean, harvesting is like the plants are mostly dead now. Like
Hmm.
if you're not just taking seeds and fruit, like the plant is now dead.
Yeah.
You're going to feed on that through the winter. And that I think more so than Capricorn season when you better have already had those resources because you're certainly not getting any now.
Hmm.
So yeah, that's just sort of another sort of train of thought I've been going on with that sort of like Mars versus Saturn tension. Um,
Yeah.
yeah.
Yeah. And I think too, what's interesting about Scorpio season in general is also just that how many cultures celebrate the dead at that time, right? Like Dia de los
Hmm.
Muertos, and like there's so many different ones. I think there's a Chinese holiday around that time too, where they celebrate their dead, right? And there's also like this, again, comfort with not even death as a concept, but like a appreciation and celebration for the fact that like the dead were once here, are maybe still here, that we can kind of have relationships with them. And there's almost like this ancestral tie, I think, that comes through.
Hmm.
And have you ever seen anything with the death card and like ancestor work or anything of that nature?
Yeah, constantly. So it's so tied into my own personal work with animal ancestors in particular, just in my
Mm.
personal practice. But yeah, it comes up constantly for me. It's for me, maybe more than other people, like it is a very common daily draw. It's like a good sign if I get a new deck and that's the first card that pops out. I see that a lot. I actually don't personally do a lot of human ancestor work, just because just kind of my own fractured family tree. There's a lot of
Hmm.
tracking down
Yeah.
to be
Yeah.
done. So that hasn't been as big of a theme for me, but it's absolutely something that I see with ancestor work, especially paired with other cards. Cups certainly quite a bit,
Yeah.
I think, with
Yeah.
ancestors. Yeah.
Yeah, which makes perfect sense for Scorpio, right? Because this is the water element. So
Mhm.
if we're breaking this down into, let's say, the decans and their association with the minor arcana, this is the five, six,
Mhm.
seven of cups, right?
Mhm.
Which tells kind of a subset of the greater story, which is really interesting. And I'm having a brain blast moment that I didn't have before this episode where I'm connecting the decanic story of the five, six, seven to the greater
Mhm.
concept of death. And I can't even begin to articulate what's going on in my brain right now. But there is kind of this that same story, right? Where it's like
Mhm.
something happens that is usually emotionally disturbing or confronting in the Five of Cups, right? There's a disappointment. You're crying over spilled milk, sort of thing, or maybe it's something that's actually a little bit more serious. Depends on the situation, depends on the question. You get to the Six of Cups, there's a little bit more of this like spirit of regeneration and connection and hope and generosity. And that middle decan is, yeah, very concerned with that like transfer of wisdom and like merging with something. And then you get to the Seven of Cups, where you have like all of these choices, but there's kind of like this wistful, nostalgic
Mm.
energy that really
Mhm.
comes through in the Decan as well, which is kind of like it's a very haunted decan is kind of like what I say to people. And I
Mm,
see people all the time with placements here who are psychic or who are mediums or who can communicate with the dead. And so you almost like reach the story kind of in the greater context of things of like something ends, you find some type of harmony, peace, regeneration, something grows there. And then also there's like the decomposition and the haunting, ghostly
mhm.
thing that happens in that final decan that I feel I did not articulate that well because I just thought of it in this moment. Connects back to the story of death in Scorpio in a greater way.
Yeah,
But
that's
yeah,
my midheaven decan.
we love her.
Yeah. Well, and I think in Six of Cups, I think especially too is a big ancestry tie because you kind of have this like childhood nostalgia, family, like that's a big theme with
Yeah,
the Six of Cups too.
totally. And you have that almost like same small child on the death card as well, which is like an
Mm,
interesting tie-in, right? Which, I think in some very symbolic ways you could say is like the death of innocence, right? And that can come with that if you wanted to take on a little bit more of like a symbolic, I mean, it's all symbols, but like a more
hmm.
less literal concrete death and a little bit more of a metaphorical one, like the death of
Yeah.
innocence, which is a death, you know what I mean? It's the death of motherhood in a lot of ways.
Hmm.
And then you see that kind of mirroring too. And like you get to the Seven of Cups and you've left that sweet innocence behind of like the child and the older figure exchanging something. But that makes a lot of sense that if you had those two cards paired together, Death and the Six of Cups, that there would be those ancestry ties. And I think it's a
Hmm.
nice way to view Scorpio that maybe doesn't get talked about a lot is that appreciation for ancestors, the dead, and the celebration
Mm.
of life that is no longer living in that specific context anymore.
Yeah, absolutely. That feels very dignified Mars too,
Mm.
which and that's and like
We're gonna come back to
I'm not an
Capricorn.
astrologer. I know, right? Well, I'm thinking about Scorpio as kind of like Mars preferred domicile,
Totally.
right? And so there's sort of a regal aspect, celebratory aspect that I could see, and like maybe again, doing some bong rips in my brain, but I think that like that celebratory aspect that feels like a well-placed
Mm-hmm.
Mars.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, if you think about Mars as champion, right? It's like, well, the champion won
Yeah.
something, and now there's the celebration, and you're getting the crown of laurels on your head, and there is kind of this, very like boisterous thing that happens afterwards, right?
Mhm.
After the victory, after you fight in a battle and you win, you go celebrate with your buddies and have a drink or what have you. At least that's how it looks in Game of Thrones. I'm sure that's not how it actually goes in real life anymore. But there is kind of that like Marsy archetype. But when you were saying dignified Mars, like of course I started thinking about Mars's exaltation in Capricorn, right? And that being
Mm,
Saturn's
hmm.
sign, and also the connection of once again, we're just back to this like it doesn't fit quite right. And that's
Right. Yeah.
so annoying. And also, in a lot of ways, I feel like the Golden Dawn tried to tried to do what Ptolemy tried to do with astrology, which is like, let me just put it all together and like I promise it makes sense. Like it's all gonna fit, you guys. Like we figured it out. And it's like, no, no, you didn't. And now everybody thinks that it doesn't work because you said that this is the one way it works. And when they disproved that, now the whole thing
Yeah.
gets tossed out. And I feel like in a way they tried so hard to make it fit that it's always going to feel slightly unsatisfying. And I think we've had a really interesting conversation about the ways in which Scorpio and Death do work together, and also the ways that there is these tension points, especially with Saturn and
Yeah.
Capricorn and Death, and how maybe that's not something that feels super comfortable to you when you think about Scorpio and Death, and that's also okay. I think it was a Meg Jones Wall and Jana Cadlick just did a whole thing about this. And I haven't had a chance to watch it, but did a
Hmm.
whole course of like reimagining the signs and the
Yes.
associations
Yeah.
that we give tarot cards in their astrological correspondences. And I haven't watched it, as I said, but they both do amazing work. So recommendation to go to go
Yeah,
explore
I'm very
that.
stoked to dig into it myself too.
Yeah, but I
Yeah.
know one of the things they said about that is like you can also come up with your own things. And this is where it's like if you have your set of symbols, the universe is going
Yeah,
to use those symbols to communicate with you for you to do divination, right? It's like
absolutely.
if for you a bird flying in from the right means this and you need that sign, the universe is going to send you a bird flying in from the right because that's the way that you and the universe communicate together. So if for you
Mhm.
death isn't Scorpio and death is Capricorn, that's okay, like that's also
Mhm.
allowed. Like you can make your own meaning. And I think that we can get kind of sticky about this in astrology because we want it all to be this like standard tradition and rigid. And I get it as like a very technical astrologer. I also kind of lose my mind when people are like, Mercury exalts in Aquarius or whatever, like I have Mercury in Aquarius and I'm still like, no, it does not. Um, but if that's your symbols, that's why we can all practice different forms of astrology. That's why we can all use different house systems. That's why sidereal works and why the tropical zodiac works, right? It's like as long as you have a cohesive set of symbols, and that's what you use time and time again, and that's the way that you've come to understand your divination system. That's literally all that matters.
Right. Exactly.
Yeah.
Because ideally, people are coming to you to divine an answer. They're not necessarily. Sometimes they are coming because they want to play with that system specifically. And I say not necessarily because, I mean, like, if you're going to stop by a witch shop, if you're going to go to Salem, like, you want a tarot reading. But if you're coming to a particular diviner with a particular, set of symbols, what matters is that you get there
Mm-hmm.
in the end. And I think it only makes you a better diviner to kind of sit and grapple with those symbols and figure out what means what to you. And it's such a human thing to want to find patterns and to fold the patterns together,
Yeah.
and find truth. And a lot of symbols come out of that tension too.
Yeah.
I think just makes you a lot stronger.
Yeah, and I think that there's ways in which they can support each other, right? Like my understanding of the decans exploded when I started thinking about the tarot associations. And I lean
Mhm.
probably more heavily on the tarot associations than some other practitioners do with their understanding of the decans. That's also really helped me in my practice. That doesn't have to be true for everybody, but the folding can be supportive. But if you're never willing to poke at the folding, then there's always probably going to be some ways if it really isn't two cohesive systems that they're going to come, at odds with each other at times. And so you have to reckon with that, and I think good diviners, astrologers included, like have to keep poking at your idea of what the thing is, even when and especially when it's uncomfortable to do the poking,
Yeah,
you know?
yeah. What's This process has been really funny for me as like a certified Golden Dawn hater is gonna like have a seance to revive Yeats and have a Yeats Yates and have a fist fight. Um, and I was so prepared to come out of it and be like, it is not Scorpio.
Yeah.
It is not Mars. Um, and yet,
And yet it
and yet,
kind of is anyway.
yeah.
But I think that this was a really fun conversation. And I think we took it in a lot of different directions. And I don't think it was probably what people were expecting when they clicked on this episode at all. And I think that's a good thing. I hope that we challenged and kind of cracked open the idea that one thing has to exactly match another thing. And I'm glad that we did, or you did, such justice to the history of where we got these from in the first place, because you can start seeing very early on how they're just kind
Hmm.
of throwing everything together in a hodgepodge. And when you do that, it kind of reminds me of like human design a little bit, right? It's like you've pulled all of these different systems together and you might be able to use that system to get really good information because there's good information on all those individual systems. And also sometimes when you do that, it wasn't meant to be combined, because those things come from different cultures, they come from different traditions and perspectives. And I'm not trying to hate on human design. I'm so sorry to any human design lovers out there. Gotten a human design reading. It was good. You know what I mean? That's not what I'm trying to say. But don't cancel me. At the same time, sometimes it's okay for a system to just exist as itself, and we don't have to blend. And then, sometimes it's helpful to do the blending, but knowing where it all comes from and what informs it, I think is really important at the end of the day.
Yeah, I'm just thinking about Samuel Mathers and the Golden Dawn doing the human design of 1809. Is
That's the
where
episode,
we're
folks.
at. And God.
Cut. Well, no, but thank you so much for coming on, for sharing it so much. Is there any kind of last thoughts that you have on death, on Scorpio, on death and Scorpio that you'd like to share with the class, Ash?
Um, I don't think so. I think for me, one of the most fun kind of threads for me to yank on personally, especially like as a lapsed Catholic, was to start kind of pulling on that specifically, and like why death as a trope was even included in this set of cards in the first place, and just kind of like tracking that through time. And this magical society current was a lot of fun for me. And I feel good that we covered that. And I hope even just beyond exploring like death and Scorpio, that people would be interested in kind of taking other symbols, or even whether it's tarot cards, other divination systems, and kind of following that thread back and just kind of seeing what they find. Because I think the context of why people think of a symbol a given way for their history and their location, is really fascinating, and really can bolster your practice as a diviner too, because then you can think about your own context and how that symbol would evolve, and that's something that's really cool to me. And I think death is such a powerful symbol that there's a lot to feed into, like a lot of really interesting ideas, to take into that imagery, that I love.
Yeah. And if you want to explore death a little bit more on your own, check out Ash's Death in the Coffin zine. Absolutely incredible. Also, you have the written article up on your website, on your blog,
On my
correct?
blog. Yep. Yeah. So something that I'm trying to do with the zines, and I am working on more for the future, is the article with the zine will always be available for free online. But in today's like very global culture, I'm like desperately trying to create like a little tangible artifact, with
No,
these zines too. So
it's so good. I was so excited to receive something in the mail that I could spread out on my desk and like do a proper spread. It just, there's something magical about that you can't kind of
yeah,
replace that human touch feel
yeah,
with. So I'm so excited that you're doing
yeah.
tangible physical zines, in the year of our Lord and Savior 2025.
Right.
We need some
Yeah.
we
They're
need
very
some of
fun. So
that.
yeah, people can get both the essay on my blog, and then there's also a link to my Ko-fi shop on my blog. And also the zines are sized on purpose for me to just use first class mail, so we will not be dealing with any global tariffs
No,
or
it was so
other.
cheap. I got it shipped to France. It was like $8 with shipping or something like that. It was ridiculously affordable. So it was amazing. Are you currently taking readings or are you closed at the moment?
So I'm actually, by the time this episode comes out, I will be close to opening my year ahead readings. I'm not sure what my divination calendar is going to look like into the coming months, but I will definitely be offering year aheads for kind of the winter season. So that, if not open by the time this episode comes out, will be close to opening. And definitely the best way to hear about that, I would say, because I'm terrible at posting regularly, is my mailing list, which there is also a link to, on my website. And then if
Amazing.
you're an RSS bitch, by the time this comes out, I will have sorted out my updates versus essays RSS feeds too. So if you like
We
those
love it.
instead of email.
No, I gotta say, Ash and I do a reading trade actually every year and have for the past
Hmm.
3 years now, I think.
I think three, yeah.
3 years, yeah. And Ash predicted my pregnancy accurately. Ash has predicted major events in my life, deaths included. And so, metaphorical
Yeah.
and not so metaphorical ones. So I would genuinely say that you are one of the best cartomancers that I have ever worked with. And so if you guys are thinking about getting a year ahead reading and you maybe don't want astrology, but you want someone who's astrology fluent, which I love about Ash, because I can be like, hey, this transit's happening. And we can do cards about the transit, so it's a really cool approach. You have a really unique approach to blending tarot and Lenormand that is just absolutely incredible and startlingly accurate. So check out Ash's readings for sure. All of the links will be in the description below. And we hope you guys enjoyed this episode and that it gave you a little something to chew on before Scorpio season starts in just a couple of days now. So thanks for listening to Threads of Fate, and we will catch you in the next one. Bye.
Bye.